Hi, hello everybody. Welcome to our podcast, and hello rest of the team. How are you?
Oh yeah, good.
Morning.
Hello.
Hello. Um, so, in this session, we're going to look at ego defense mechanisms and basically the ideas of Freud. And one of the things that struck me when I was thinking about this session was that in a way, we're going back to some of the very sort of basic ideas associated with psychology. And I think lots of people are interested in studying psychology because they sort of want to know about themselves and understand what makes them tick and what makes other people tick. And actually, these are the questions that Freud started out with. You know, he was just really curious about who we are and why we are. And I think one of the things that I was struck by is, much of psychology these days is kind of framed in scientific terms. So you kind of go and see a psychologist and they will, have a kind of intervention with you that helps you adapt your behavior to meet the demands of, living in a quite difficult world, or diminishing or reducing behaviours that might be difficult. So I might go and see a psychologist and they will probably be a kind of CBT based psychologist that will give me a series of exercises to help me manage my behaviours. And I just wanted to sort of start this podcast with pointing out that these weren't questions for Freud. He wasn't that interested in people reducing difficult behaviours. He's interested in just kind of knowing who people are. And all that kind of, behavioural adaptation stuff comes later. So in a way, we're going back to the basics. Who are we and why are we and why do we behave in certain ways? And that's it. There aren't kind of suggestions about homework that you can do to stop this or change it. And so, open your mind a bit and let's float back. There's going to be quite a lot of history in this because I love it, but also I think it helps understand where Freud essentially was coming from with the work he did around ego defense mechanisms. And he started the work, and his daughter Anna Freud carried on much of his work, and we'll be talking about her later. But so a bit of a history lesson. You've got a swirly kind of music. You can imagine a kind of as being propelled backwards into 1856, and Freud was born in a town called Freiburg, and that's now in the Czech Republic. It was, in those days, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is kind of, a huge kind of empire in that part of the world. And it was before countries were defined like Czechoslovakia. And very early on, when he was a child, he moved to Vienna with his family. He was Jewish. He was born from a very sort of respectable Jewish family, and he was a bit of a golden child and encouraged to pursue a very sort of respectable career. So one of those was to become a doctor, and like GP doctor, like a medicine doctor. And from early on, Freud was really interested in this idea of memory, because it's the place where the biological, like we have kind of memories encoded in our brain, but also the psychological, it's like how we interpret those memories is a psychological phenomena, rather than we're not just like recording equipment, we don't experience something and just record the basic facts of it. There's a huge amount of kind of emotion and kind of self in that moment. So, and the other thing to kind of bear in mind was when Freud was kind of starting out, psychology was considered a branch of philosophy until the 1870s. So actually, it wasn't a kind of medical, like, yes, we're going to study psychology. Psychology was thought of as a kind of philosophical, investigation into kind of the world and understanding. And so Freud's kind of way, if you read Freud's writing, he doesn't kind of write like a CBT manual these days. He writes in this kind of way that brings in lots of literature and myth, and it reads like literature. And that was the Freud I was introduced to. I kind of came across Freud through what was an English postgraduate course, and it was viewed very much as literature rather than a scientific manual. So in a way, what Freud's trying to do is create a language to understand ourselves, and that language isn't a sort of flat, factual medical language. It's a very poetic and kind of expressive language, which that's one of the things I really love. So as a young man, Freud went to study in Paris. So he's kind of training to be a sort of doctor, like, GP doctor. And he was working, his speciality was he was training as a neurologist. So somebody who was trying to kind of understand our nervous systems, our human nervous systems. So Freud goes off to study with a guy called Charcot, who at that point was like the big name, the daddy of neurology in a hospital in Paris. And Charcot kind of discovered multiple sclerosis and something called the Charcot-Marie Tooth disease, which is a muscular disease, and it's not about teeth. He worked with somebody called Mr. Tooth. But these early days of Charcot as well, I mean, there is no kind of electronic imaging. They're discovering how the nervous system works by dissection and kind of cutting bodies up and things like that. So, it's very sort of important to kind of remember how these guys were working, And one of the things at that point, Charcot sort of believed that hysteria was, and it was widely thought that hysteria was hereditary. It was like a disease of the nervous system. But during Charcot's work, and Freud is kind of studying with him in Paris, he actually discovered that the hysteria. So what was happening is people were coming to see Charcot, and they were having kind of fits and kind of hysterical convulsions and so on. And I think on the handout we're going to be sending out with this, there are some images of that. And so previously people have thought, okay, it's a hereditary thing, it's something to do with your nervous system. So Charcot's big sort of discovery was that actually people were having these kind of traumas not because of physical biological things that happened to them, but it was an emotional response. And that's the big kind of moment, if you like, where people are understanding trauma as not just a physical thing. And the other kind of important work Charcot did was, trauma and kind of hysteria was mainly thought to be something that women suffered because they were weak and not able to kind of manage stuff. And actually Charcot did a lot of work on male trauma and hysteria. And kind of also worked a lot with soldiers and kind of recognizing that the kind of occupations that might have been seen as very sort of masculine and macho, actually the men who were presenting with trauma were, it wasn't a kind of weakness of masculinity, if you understand. So Freud is learning from Charcot that non-biological trauma can cause hysteria, and that hysteria can be an expression of early traumatic experience. So very important, Freud learns this. He goes back to work as a medical doctor in Austria, and he is really kind of fascinated by the idea of the unconscious, and that seemingly kind of meaningless behaviours were an expression of what was going on underneath. So, Freud's kind of work is over 40 years, and he didn't just like wake up one morning and have an idea and go, well, there you go, there's psychoanalysis I've invented. It's like his work is fascinating to read because you can kind of plot his own kind of journey into learning. He writes in sort of earlier work, he kind of contradicts in later works and so on, because he's just learning. And but one of his very important early concepts was this idea of repression, which, I think with lots of things with Freud, it's like, because they're so much part of our everyday language, it seems kind of obvious. It's like, oh yeah, repression, that's when people kind of shut stuff away. But at the time when Freud's writing about it, that's really radical stuff, that's seemingly kind of inconsequential, like dreams or kind of slips of the tongue. Freud is going like, no, these are really, really important. So one of his really key ideas is this idea of repression. And that means that, if something's unacceptable for us, we turn away from it and hide it from ourselves. And we sort of dump it in the unconscious. It's like the unconscious, it's like spare room or something. There's probably even more kind of locked away than that. But, you just dump a load of stuff somewhere because you can't deal with it. And so Freud's kind of really interested. He's not interested in sort of saying, oh, that's wrong, you shouldn't do that. He's just interested in why people are doing this. And actually, in Freud's earlier work, he was kind of much more interested in bringing these kind of unconscious, what you've dumped in your unconscious, into kind of consciousness. But actually, kind of the later work he's writing about, he's much more interested in how you manage to kind of negotiate and interact with the kind of real world, rather than going back into all the kind of dark kind of unconscious. Are you all with me? I feel like you've all drifted off somewhere. You're all
completely gripped.
You're all in sort of, waltzing around in Austria somewhere in like 1905 or something. Okay.
No, it's good. It's good to get a history, like a history perspective kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just like, I do want people to kind of just, think, gosh, this is just somebody kind of going, who are we? How do we work in the world? So the really key really key piece of work is published in 1923, and please, listeners who can speak German, you'll have to kind of cover your ears or something, because he publishes a kind of piece of work called Das Ich und das Eis, and that is the worst German accent ever. But sort of roughly translated, this means the eyes and the it, and the eyes don't mean like visualize. I mean the letter I. And this is actually what's called Freud's structural model. So basically, why I'm telling you this in really bad German, it's really important, because I'll explain. So basically, in this model, Freud goes, we as human beings are sort of motivated by drives, and these drives are called by Freud eros and thanatos, which is very sort of it's life and death. These are our drives. They're the desire to kind of live, but also, and very importantly, there's a sort of destructiveness in us. And what Freud was describing in this work is how the ego, the self, how the self manages these drives of life and death. The really important thing is to note that the terms id and ego and superego, which are most associated with this, aren't really descriptions of that. They were terms adapted by his translator into English, a guy called James Stracey. So actually, I just want to sort of think for a moment, like, Freud's description are the eyes, the self, and the it. And so, he's very clear about the self. There are two selves, and then there is the it. And Freud kind of describes this as the sort of simple I and the over I. God, I feel like this is really confusing. So, and then the it. So when I say I go out for a walk, it's not actually, it's only one part of me. There's actually a whole part of me that goes out for a walk. And it's like the I me, the ego me, the over I, which is translated as the super ego, and the really, really dark it bit of me. And I am all these people. And, when people sort of say, oh, I don't know what came over me, Freud would say that the it came over you, or the id part of your personality. Oh, I don't know why I did that. We are full of kind of unconscious motivations about our behaviour, Freud believed. And I think, you know, the kind of terms developed by his translator of the id, the ego, and the superego are kind of helpful because they're sort of differentiations. They kind of define different parts of the self. But there's something really powerful as like understanding this kind of conflict between the I and then the above I and the below the it. And
that's really helpful, because I was kind of seeing it in a very kind of vertical way, like the above, the bit at the top, and then the kind of the middle bit, and then this kind of thing in the basement or the depths. Like there was this very kind of vertical visual that I was getting in my head. So I think that really helps.
Yeah, it's it kind of gets a bit hard to do this on podcasts, but and normally when I'm kind of delivering training, I draw it like a burger bun, which I developed, and it's like if you imagine your kind of yourself is this kind of burger in between these kind of buns of, you know, superego and id, or above I and the it. And basically, Freud sort of says that we're born like in our id. It's a really important part of our personality, because as babies, it's the thing that kind of gets our needs met. So, and actually, this is based on what Freud called the pleasure principle, which is, you know, in other words, the it gets whatever it wants when it needs it, with no consideration of reality of the situation. So when a child is hungry, they just want food and they cry. They don't think, oh, it's a bit, you know, it's like, oh, it's 11:30 in the morning, it's a bit early for lunch. You know, they are like, no, food now. And like to whole, you know, Freud thinks about kind of how that child goes through various stages and matures to understand that there's a world it needs to negotiate with. And while I was kind of writing this, I was thinking about how, you know, and I'll put it back on myself a bit, because I want to sort of recognize that I'm not just saying, oh yeah, people who have struggles with drugs or that. But, you know, when I was, throughout most of my life, I just couldn't face the world or negotiate the world. So I was constantly thrown back into a sort of well, I want to do this now. Why is the world being so unreasonable and asking me to do something that I can't do? Because I never really learnt to do it. That makes sense. The ego bit of me never really grew up. I was just like a fucking baby. But I was, 30.
Yeah, do you know what? It makes absolute sense. And to be quite honest, I feel quite itish or quite iddish right now. You know, I feel like a bit of an uncontrollable wild force right now, if I'm honest with you. So, yeah, true sailors.
Say more, Bex.
Well, you know, you just want to be like, I don't know, this. It's like what Liz was saying earlier. I don't know why I did that. Well, that's kind of pretty much like, you know, me at the moment. Like, why am I doing that? Why am I doing what? This ain't like me. What? It's like I'm running naked through the streets or something. Do you know what I mean? Because I have this uncontrollable kind of like force within me. Like I feel really full of energy, but I'm not too sure where it's coming from.
But it relates a lot to what you said about like young babies before they go through, like, I don't know if you'd call it higher stages of development, but like the idea that there's something like some kind of force that drives you to react a certain way if you haven't got a basic need that is being met. And yeah, there's no sort of rationalizing it.
No, and it's interesting because like Freud kind of basically sort of says, look, children kind of develop, and if it all goes well, and they develop, the sort of sense of self, the ego develops on what Freud calls a reality principle, which is just kind of like it sounds really. It's like you learn to deal with reality. But I'm guessing what we're all recognizing is that if you have experienced trauma and felt really unsafe as a little baby, then you never quite kind of get into that development, and there's all that kind of Bex's itish behaviour.
Yeah. Solved. Case solved.
But also if we think of ourselves, I know you're not very well today, Bex, just for our listeners who can't see Bex's swollen face. But when we're not when the world is difficult, we literally go back into kind of baby mode, don't we? Curl up in bed, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Cover, you know, sort of the so-called duvet days. We just, you know, want to be like, oh, I'm a little baby, I can't cope with the world. And I think, you know, I don't want to get too sort of tangled up in Freud's kind of, I feel like I am already, but I don't want to get too tangled up in like, this is Freud's theory, blah, blah, blah. Because actually, look, it's really fucking simple. You know, he's kind of saying there's three, you're a whole person, there's three bits of you. There's the really, you know, ittish bit that you were born with, and then as you mature, you learn a kind of reality principle, how to negotiate the world better. Yeah. And then you also developed, you know, Freud says, like, you then take in, you kind of take in external, you know, sort of demands, what he would call the over I or the super I, which are kind of, you know, more kind of like cultural and social ways of behaving, like, oh, you can't do that. So in some people, that over I is really, really strong, and their kind of sense of self is quite small. So if we go back to the kind of burger analogy, that, you know, the little burger or veggie burger, if you want to be, but the little burger bit of you is tiny, and the bun, you know, the super ego bun is really kind of hefty and doughy, and the under I, you know, it bun is also kind of hefty, and that you're just this tiny little, you know, kind of morsel in between those two things.
And it's just not an enjoyable burger.
No, it's horrible. It's like, what you need is a burger, is a really nice, let's all be vegetarian for, you know, a really lovely, juicy vegan burger with nicely kind of measured, you know, top and bottom buns.
I think we're going to have to, Liz, you're going to have to do us a drawing for the handout, man, because I think everybody wants to know what this gorgeous vegan burger Yiddish bun like looks like.
Do you know what? I know one of the things that I know we talk about the training day is, you know, certainly going kind of back to my behaviour, I'd do something really Yiddish, like be an absolute arsehole. It really, you know, off my face. Go out, be an absolute prick. And then, so that was all kind of idiot. I don't fuck it. I want to do what I want. You know, everybody do anchor. And then kind of, you know, collapse at home and wake up the next morning, and then the kind of super ego, oh, you utter fuck, you can't remember what you've done, but like, you utter prick. Why did you do that? Oh my God, you know, like full of all that sort of shame. And shame very much sort of sits in the super ego part of this. So, you know, shame is like, oh God, they'll all think you're an arsehole, which they probably did. But yeah, and so what I kind of found that I was just, you know, kind of moving between the kind of the doughy id bit and the really doughy super ego bit, and myself just got lost. I got smaller and smaller. My burger got smaller and smaller. Mm. And I'd just like to point out that this is, you know, nobody else talks about it like this way, so I have to trademark this bit. But, you know, like our book's going to be called something like Being a Bigger Burger. Being a bigger juicy burger. But anyway, so this is all kind of, you know, like Freud's kind of like the ego is just this thing that's kind of caught in the middle of something, and actually it's really hard to negotiate because, you know, reality is really, really difficult, and reality involves other people and their own weird shit. So the poor ego is kind of stuck here trying to negotiate the world. But of course, the idea with the work we're trying to do, and the idea, if you would go and see a therapist or something like that, is to sort of develop a sense of self, a really strong burger, a really sense of who you are, so that negotiation and interaction with the world becomes a little easier. And so you're not just flipping between those kind of two buns. So Freud, like, this took Freud quite a long time to kind of develop all this work, and so he kind of basically said that the ego develops defense mechanisms to just look after itself, really, and they're sort of psychological strategies brought into play by the sort of unconscious. So unconsciously, they're often unconscious, the defense mechanisms, but it's our unconscious way of looking after ourselves. And it's to defend the ego state, against feelings of anxiety or unacceptable impulses, because those impulses, those drives, might be understood as socially unacceptable, and actually that they might be repressed or shut down because the unconscious recognizes that they need to be. So also, just at this point, sort of Freud gets so far with defense mechanisms, and then his work in the last 15 years of his life, he was looked after by his daughter, Anna Freud, who I hadn't known much about, actually, and kind of in the research for this, I love to start to really love Anna Freud. I think she's really interesting, and she did a lot of work. She opened a Montessori school in London. And she was really interested in kind of like children and kind of them, once again, being able to kind of develop a really kind of healthy sense of self through those kind of, principles of Montessori, of the importance of children not being just trained like little, soldiers, about them discovering who they are through that approach. And I don't know, does anybody know much about Montessori? I just kind of think of it as some nice, like, children get to play and so on.
No.
Something about self-directed learning, like you let the children decide what activities they want to do. But I don't know if that's a gross simple.
Yeah, you don't have specific set times of doing this, now we're going to do this, now we're going to do that. You've got things available at different tables, and then the kids just go and choose what they want to do when they want to do it, and they don't necessarily do academic stuff till quite later. I think like above 7, or they don't push academic stuff at all. It comes down to the children to choose what they want to do.
There's a lot of play as well for quite a long time. Yeah.
It makes total sense, doesn't it, in terms of this kind of ego defense, ego development. Sorry, not ego defense. It's like you find out who you are in a really natural way by following what you want to do in a setting with other children. So it's not just like selfish, iddish, like I want to do this. You're actually kind of negotiating what you want as a child with other children.
And totally, because I think it's also that thing of not introducing too much of a superego at a young age, like feeling shame because, you can't write neatly or add up maths in, as fast as your friends or as much as the teacher wants or something.
It's so horrible, isn't it? I mean, it's just like, oh, fuck, we bring up children like they're fucking dogs or something. Not to be horrible to dog owners, but it's
I bring up our dogs much better than kids sometimes.
Future workers, isn't it? Future workers.
Yeah. Can hell. Anyway, so I feel a bit overwhelmed with the kind of sadness then. Like, how are people supposed to know who they are when, actually it's just a load of superego, commands. It's not surprising that people act up as, id-style children, is it? When you're brought up in a world full of awful kind of like, you got to do this, you got to do that. So
loads of child psychology, isn't there, that was influenced by Freud, and people still now saying like it's so basic. You got to understand when people are acting out as kids in school, it's not because they're bad or naughty. Like they just have a different learning style. They're just learning at a different pace, and they shouldn't be punished or excluded.
It is extraordinary to think about this. I mean, Freud's not alone. I mean, kind of, there were other people doing kind of work around this time. But if you think of this as being basically about 100 years old, these kind of insights into like, how children develop, and, Anna Freud's work with child development is great. And that's kind of 1930s-ish. 40s, 30s. And we talked about John Bowlby and, and attachment theory. And it's a bit like nobody's fucking got the message yet. Can you swear on podcasts? Which you can, kind of.
It's a bit late for that, Liv.
We can edit that out. But it's a bit like, fucking hell, come on. Like, it's not really difficult to understand. So, yeah, sorry. Just kind of slight diversion there. But yeah, so it's a like, I hope this idea of kind of this like fragile ego trying to negotiate the world and getting all these kind of commands like superego, oh, you can't do that, and on all these kind of drives is really, really difficult. So Freud sort of basically said this leads to what we call anxiety. And he sort of identified 3 kinds of anxiety, and one is neurotic anxiety, which is a very unconscious way, like worry that we'll lose control over our kind of it or idis urges, resulting in punishment. So, you know, ooh, I feel like I'm going to lose control is what would be called by Freud a neurotic anxiety. The second type is what he would call a reality anxiety, which is a fear of real world events, and the cause of anxiety is usually identified. And this is the kind of, you know, somebody might worry, might fear, you know, getting a dog bite when they're near a frightening dog. We talked about this when we talked about the last podcast, didn't we, about overwhelming feelings. And this is what Freud calls reality anxiety. And I'm guessing that currently, you know, there are real, when I go out shopping at the moment, I notice my sense of anxiety is heightened by, you know, people coming closer than 2 meters to me and things like that. You know, it's like I can feel it raising in me. I don't know about other people. Was it just me?
Is anyone else experiencing this phenomena of like going shopping for stuff and then having really shit shops, like coming out with like not a very kind of coherent set of things in your basket? Because there's a veg shop and I'll kind of like wait in this veg shop. I'm queuing outside. My anxiety's building. Going this, and I have so much anxiety that I just make really shit decisions, and I come out with a really weird selection of like fruit and veg.
Yeah, I mean, I quite enjoy shopping for food because I enjoy cooking. Normally, this is, you know, so normally I'd kind of take myself off to Sainsbury's, whatever, and I'm like, oh yeah, I could do that and that, you know, I could, you know, sort of sweet potatoes are reduced. Oh, I know, I could kind of do something with them. And at the moment, I'm just kind of going in there and with a list and kind of getting stuff and feeling really, really stressed by the experience and other people. Not recognizing social distancing. So yeah, I mean, you know, Freud, that's a kind of, Freud would sort of say that's not neurotic. It's not that you're worried about your id will kind of explode. It's actually really, really based on reality. So the ego in that moment, the self in that moment, is actually just identifying stuff going on around it, going, yeah, okay, this is threatening. And it might need to kind of defend itself, right? So when people are shopping in these anxious times, people might become, you know, less, less open or less kind of friendly or something because they're frightened. They're kind of protecting themselves. The third type of anxiety Freud sort of identified was a moral anxiety, which is kind of going against your own moral principles. And this is, I mean, it's kind of, I don't want to spend too much time because it's not that relevant to what we're talking about today. But if there's a belief that's really strongly installed in you that, you know, homosexuality is a sin, then you have kind of these attractions that, you know, to other men or women, that will create anxiety with the ego bit of you, because the ego is trying to negotiate those two conflicting, you know, drives, or the drive that conflicts with the principle. So Anna Freud, so Freud dies. He moves to London. I think it's like 1939. It's just as the Second World War, you know, he basically has to kind of get out of Germany because he's Jewish. So he kind of is in London in 39, I think. But in Anna Freud, who's working with him in the last 15 years of his life, publishes a book called The Ego and Mechanisms of Defense in 1936 and 37 in English. So basically what Anna Freud's doing is taking like the work that Freud had started and kind of extends it and through her work with children. And she basically kind of extended Freud's defense mechanisms. She named these defense mechanisms, and I'll kind of go through them. I don't want to just kind of read them out in a monotone voice, so I'll do a bit of acting. So the 10 defense mechanisms identified by Freud are denial, which is you just refuse to admit the reality of a situation, and can you sort of see that the ego might need to kind of employ that in the moment? They might just need to go, right, this is not happening because it's too overwhelming, it's too difficult to deal with. The second one is repression, where you bury a painful experience or memory. Once again, it's too anxiety inducing, it's too painful to kind of remember that thing, so it's repressed. The third is regression, where you kind of revert back to a childhood emotional state, and sort of lots of fears and anxieties reappear because you kind of gone back into this childhood state because you can't deal with what's going on. But you'll often display lots of kind of immature behaviour. The fourth one is displacement, where usually if you have a feeling that makes you uncomfortable, but you can't really express it, you'll take it out on something else. And the kind of most commonly used example of this is like somebody goes to work and they feel belittled and bullied by their boss. So they'll go home and kick the dog or cat, which is horrible, I know. But I mean, to be more serious, actually, for a second, a lot of male anger that can't be expressed seems to be kind of displaced upon women. This is domestic, so if you feel impotent, and there's an interesting word, but if you feel impotent or powerless, in some way, people will displace their anger onto somebody less powerful than themselves.
You made a really good point. I can't remember when it was, when you were talking about kind of, sports being stopped and kind of there not being football and things like that. And I guess you could see, I mean, this is kind of hugely stereotypical, but, why not? You could see that a lot of kind of, for men, I think a lot of their ways of channeling their particular emotions are through something like football. So I guess you could see that as like a displacing of like one emotion, but it has this kind of outlet, and when that's taken away, it can be, channeled towards women instead.
It's really weird, Bob. I was just talking about that this morning to my partner. I was reading, to my shame, I was reading a football blog I follow, and I said, we kind of really miss football, and then I sort of talked about how it, about a year and a half ago, I went to the football match, Premier League football match, for the first time in fucking years, since the 1970s, and it was so frightening. I can't express how I just picked up on all this absolute kind of male energy. It was male energy, it was like 3 women there, me and my sister, and we were a crowd at Fulham FC, which is not the most kind of bigger, one of the bigger clubs. It's quite a nice family club. Oh my God, it was like being around all this weird testosterone. It was.
Yeah, I agree. I went to Arsenal back when it was at Highbury. One of my mates was really into Arsenal, and I was just like, holy crap, yeah. It felt like I was in like a little testosterone bubble or something. Because like you're there to see a match, like it's football and stuff, but actually in the crowd, when you're kind of, around just like a load of men who are, making quite, awful jokes. I went to tell him now.
I mean, this is so interesting, isn't it? Because I haven't intended to go here, but it's like, it's so Freudian. What you see happen is like, for some reason, male, let's not be all, men who go to football matches are also like, it's a place where people can be racist or feel they can be racist, and that is such an expression of kind of inner fear of difference and things like that. But somehow, in that crowd, that kind of, expression is the place to do it. Oh God, it's so horrible.
Well, it's that thing I think we talked about on the kind of first podcast. I'm going to keep saying this, I love it, that definition of it's not definition, it's the root of emotion in movere, to move out. It's just like, emotions need to go somewhere.
Yeah.
And that's such a classic example. Like, I bet a load of blokes, I mean, we are losing a whole potential audience right now. But, like in, stereotypically, like a lot of guys in football matches and stuff like that, it's just this permitted outlet for emotions. And I
Yeah.
bet they go home and feel fucking great.
Yeah, well, that was what we were talking about. You know, I was talking about this morning. I was like, oh my God, you know, the implications of kind of lockdown. And we know that the kind of this huge increase in domestic abuse during this time, but you kind of take away football a bit, you know, and it's like, oh God, where does that energy, you know, where is that expressed?
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Exactly.
yeah, I think it's really horrible. So anyway, can we move on?
Yeah.
That's displacement. Then the next one is projection, and this is once again it's one of those things where when we do it on training, people are like, "Oh yeah, I know that," but you know it because of Freud kind of thing. You know, he's the first person that sort of went, "Oh, you know, if you project the feelings onto other people, if you have an uncomfortable feeling, you go, oh no, you know, I hate them. They kind of, you know." They're this or that. I mean, this is all really, the really thing that always tickles me is lots of this stuff is, you know, you see in fellowship. You spot it, you got it, is, you know, that fellowship kind of, you spot it, you got it. It's pure projection. I mean, that's what that phase is talking about.
Do people tend to really kind of get what it's about?
I don't know. I hope so.
I'm just thinking, you know, again, like whenever I think about ego defense mechanisms, I kind of picture this little fragile ego, and you know, whether it's kind of strong or whether it's not, I think like as human beings, I think we are very kind of delicate and fragile. Mm-hmm. And I always kind of like picture the ego as kind of being that. And I think sometimes seeing something in ourselves which we don't like is just so horrible to admit that to yourself and to feel the feelings that go with it. So much easier to kind of project that out into someone else, because again, the emotion has to go somewhere. The charge of what you're feeling needs to have a kind of, you know, an outlet.
Yeah, and it's a defense, isn't it? That's exactly.
Yeah, but I mean, how much people kind of really get the nuance of it? Because I think it's a, you know, it's a really kind of huge thing. I mean, they're all kind of huge and kind of like quite nuanced, but I was just curious.
No. I think it's a really great point, Bob, because actually one of the, and kind of how I framed the beginning of this podcast is like one of the things that really frustrates me is, say you spot it, you got it. There then kind of tends to be something following that. It's like, oh, you've got to stop that behaviour. You know, like, oh, that's a bad thing. Oh, you know, you know, oh, look at yourself, you spot it. And it actually doesn't mean, I wish there would be a kind of, I don't know, maybe I'm doing a disservice to fellowship here, but I wish there would be sort of a more investigation around what that is and what that means for this kind of fragile self, rather than just something else you're doing wrong.
Yeah, and also why you're doing it in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the kind of probably bit that's missing. It's like, oh, well, you spot it, you got it, or I've got to stop that behaviour. Especially why, you know, the why is got to be there. And I think it gets lost a bit. Sorry.
I think that's really, yeah, you've reminded me of something about that. So that's come up, like in step work, you kind of do things like you write resentments down, and then you kind of look at those resentments from, you know, particular people or whatever, and why you have those resentments. And through doing the work, you end up kind of like finding out that those resentments, you know, can be things that are you're projecting from yourself, your own lack of this, that, or the other. So you're kind of like working on yourself by looking at why you've got these kind of issues with other people. So I guess it would come under the projection thing.
Okay, I feel suitably. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right.
I guess it's like so much of what we do generally with the different models and approaches, like taken at a surface level, it is easy to oversimplify and then through oversimplifying dismiss it or something. And people do that with Freud all the time. But when you understand a bit better, you realise how rich it is. Which doesn't mean that it isn't misused sometimes, and I think the same goes for fellowship. Like at a really surface level, if you just take away the kind of phrases that people knock off, it's probably not helpful. But like Heather said, if you apply yourself to it with like some really good intention and some good guidance, it can be really fruitful.
Yeah, okay. I think that's an important point, and it is like, I think. You know, you just remind me whenever I kind of do the down Freud, I kind of say, you know, who knows what about Freud? And sort of invariably somebody will go, who's a cocaine addict? You know, which is A, not true, and B, it's just like, that means that you don't have to kind of take, investigate anything that any of his ideas, because he was a cocaine addict, and he
was obsessed with sex.
Yeah. And it's kind of like, well,
we're only saying that from our own cultural perspective. At the time, it was completely normal. It was completely legal, and it was just another kind of medical thing that people took.
Well, he thought, very early on in his career, he thought, oh wow, this might really work for people, along the lines of how people talk about MDMA used in kind of end of life, therapy, or sort of people navigating kind of end of life stuff, or marriage or something. It's like, oh, this drug might be a useful way of working with feelings. So yeah, it's not like he was fucking, buying coke from his dealer. I think it's kind of, he's not all bloody marvellous, but I think that there's loads of stuff in there that's really helpful. And that was the idea of today, is to kind of just focus on ego defense mechanisms. So projection, we've just kind of talked about quite a lot. The other ego defense mechanism, so this Bob's poor little fragile description of this poor sort of self trying to navigate the world. The other defense mechanism is reaction formation, which Freud very interestingly very early talks about how the man who has kind of homosexual feelings will become become homophobic. Freud uses that word, homophobic, so that kind of, oh no, gay, actually, masks a desire.
Would that come under repression as well then?
Yeah. Okay, I mean, they're like running through this. Repression is really important for Freud. It's like that shoving down of, and I always imagine like it's a bit of a cliche, but that idea of like trying to get loads of shit in a suitcase, and I don't know if you've ever seen it in airports where people go and check in and they've got too much luggage weight, and then they take stuff out and like shoving it down, and it comes. What happens? It comes out sideways. So, a lot of our behavior is like what's coming out sideways from that repression. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. The other one that's is really interesting, because I think we encounter it quite a lot, and we do it quite a lot, is intellectualization, whereby you're having a really difficult feeling, and you displace, you kind of actually sort of intellectualize it by kind of cutting off from the feeling. And so the example I've kind of got on the handout is like, if you're diagnosed with cancer, rather than just experience that really kind of real fear of death, people kind of go and study scientific data and find out about it. But actually, the fear is death. It's there, and that kind of that life force, that kind of eros. And eros isn't just sexy love; it's just life. Yeah, it's not just the kind of cherub in the middle of London. Eros for Freud is just that really will to stay alive. So that kind of huge kind of feeling is that huge drive to stay alive, is challenged. And so people displace that feeling by kind of reading about it. And I feel like I'm doing it a bit now. And also I feel like with coronavirus very early on, I was just really fucking scared. I just thought, I don't want to die. I'll be so cross if I die. And I don't want to die through what I would consider government negligence. I was furious, but also scared. And how I managed that was to read about it.
Mm.
And kind of not feel it, because I didn't want to feel it, because my ego I was just frightened, right? It's just like, felt like a frightened child. And going back to another one of our podcasts, I was laughing. I was talking to somebody last night, and they're asking me how I was, and I do feel like I've gone through Kubler-Ross grief cycles, fear, and now I feel like a real kind of resignation, or my need to acceptance, yes, that's it. Yeah, my need to intellectualize has kind of gone down a bit. stopped reading so much about coronavirus. It was fucking doing my head in.
Well, it's probably ironic because it was probably a good ego defense mechanism to kind of be in the safe space of your head.
Totally.
The more you were reading stuff was probably stoking the fires of your emotions as well, which was probably getting repressed. So you have this whole kind of ego defense mechanism cocktail kind of thing going on, like loads happening at various points or at the same time.
Yeah, well, in a lot of these, and I know that Bex, if she's well enough, will talk about this a bit, because you did lots of research into kind of the levels of these defense mechanisms, didn't you, Bex?
I did indeed. And for anybody listening, I look like that chap off the Goonies right now. So, I don't know I can't really remember what his name is, but yeah. So, what?
Chubb.
Yeah, that's him. So, yeah.
Chunk. His name is Chunk.
Chunk. So I'm Chunk. So if I sound like, a bit dodgy, just envisage Chunk. Yeah, so I really, really love learning about ego defense mechanisms in general, because it just normalized, I suppose, a lot of the stuff or behaviors that I sort of go through, just in terms of, when I'm in places where I'm feeling stress, or if I kind of like, I'm feeling anxiety, I do certain behaviors. And like, I never really understood what like those behaviors were. I just thought like, I was being a bit iddish, I suppose. And very interestingly, it's a lot later than Anna Freud, this chap called George Valiant, I think it was sometime in the 70s, maybe late 70s, came up with a level system where he classified the ego defense mechanisms into 4 different levels. And I'll include a little bit more about this in the handout, because, I can kind of describe on what some of these levels are about and kind of like pinpoint what some of the defense mechanisms are with those levels. But I'll just read them out here. So you have level 1, which is pathological defenses. And so those are things like delusional projection and denial. So it's a real kind of like loss of kind of like reality, kind of like a separation from reality, if you will, which are level 1 ego defense mechanisms. Level 2 are immature defense mechanisms. So obviously immature is very different to mature. It's kind of like that childlike state. And those are things like fantasy, projection, and acting out. And I'll come back to that in a second, because there's one particular ego defense mechanism that I find that I do quite excessively in immature. But I'll move on briefly. And then you've got level 3 ego defense mechanism. So that's neurotic defenses. So those are things like intellectualization, reaction formation. And then finally, he categorized the last level as mature. So that's level 4. And this is really interesting. And I think it's really important to note, because in mature defense mechanisms, you have things like humor, suppression, altruism, and I think that that really kind of makes sense. The reason why they're mature is because if you're in a position where you're feeling stress or any sort of anxiety, you use humor. Like, actually I think that kind of like is quite a good way of coping in the short term. And as I said, I'll put a bit more of this in the handout, but I think kind of like what made sense to me is actually not only have I personally been able to sort of identify some of the things I do, it's really normalized my behaviors. And the reason why is because actually in the short term, they really help me through difficult stuff, things that I am struggling with, like right now. Like there's quite a lot going on for me, and I've had difficult accessing my emotions and stuff, and a combination of running naked down the road. But actually I find that what I did was fantasize a lot. Like I've always been in the fantasy world. Like I can get lost in my imagination for 6 to 8 hours. Like I could do a job in fantasy. And
what happens in there? I want to have a little kind of journey into Bex's head.
Oh, it's like a little Sims land, man. Like you can, I did actually have an imaginary friend, and I always said that my imaginary friend was real. Like it really was. So it's like a little Sims land. But the point is now I still fantasize. I still do it. I still go into my imagination land, but it doesn't interrupt my life anymore. Like, it's not something where, you know, I have difficult forming connection or relationships to people, you know? Now I just do it because I need to, you know, fucking escape.
Curiosity. So can I ask a quick question?
Go for it, Bobsies.
But just like say for instance, when you become aware of like going off into a kind of dream land, which does sound really amazing. Like, now that you've kind of had a recognition of like what it is, and you're able to put a word to it, it's an ego defense mechanism, it's a mature one, so you're able to kind of like use it or employ it when you need to, and it kind of serves a purpose. Are you much more conscious of when you do it? Like, is there more of a kind of an intent behind it?
Precisely, that's it. Like, and actually, fantasizing is actually an immature defense mechanism. I don't want to get too hung up on the levels, but actually, what I think within the levels is it says that if you have these defense mechanisms and you use them in short term, they can be useful. Mm-hmm. So now it's useful because I'm aware of it. It's kind of like a nice little retreat, instead of kind of like, you know, doing something like getting completely smashed on drugs. I can just go and have a nice little fantasy. Like, I can retreat into my imagination. So it really serves a purpose.
This kind of like allows you to kind of go there without the superego kind of like putting its fingers of like, oh, you shouldn't be doing that, you know, it's shame. Because partly what I was thinking was like, I know that if I kind of need to address something, or if I'm feeling emotional about something, like I can start to spin out, and generally my spinning out is like my browsers on Safari or something. So I'll have kind of like 17 open at the same time. And I kind of like, there are some times where I just think I can't deal with this shit right now. Like, I don't have the strength. I'm going to allow myself to just get lost in these 17 browsers at the same time. And that's okay, because I'll deal with it when I've got the strength to do it tomorrow or the next day. And so there's this real kind of like, I don't know, sense of permissiveness. Like, I'm going to just, can't do this right now. I'm going to really allow myself to just fucking get lost. Because it serves a purpose.
It serves a purpose. And like, you know, it's good to point out that actually sometimes these things can get away in our life. Like, our defense mechanisms can be a thing where it stops us kind of like, you know, living in reality. And you know, that's something that, you know, can be a problem, can't it? Like, you know, in my past, like, you know, I had a load of defense mechanisms which stopped me kind of like, you know, living life. And now it's kind of like, actually, I'm having a bit of a hard time. I'm really up and down, like I'm kind of cut off emotionally. And I suppose that, you know, actually, in the short term, like, I'm aware that I go into fantasy land. Like, I do a bit of work for Age UK in the morning. That's altruism. You know, I'm not doing that because I gets the help, all the kind of like all biddies of Wandsworth. Sorry, am I allowed to say all biddies? It's an endearing term, I'm telling you. But I do that as well, so it gives me some self-satisfaction.
But this is the kind of core of the podcast, really. It's like recognizing what might be defense mechanisms and how useful they are right now, without going into like, I don't do anything, but that's okay. It's about that balance, isn't it? And just as you're talking, I remember really early days of, I mean, literally kind of, you know, the first few months after giving up heroin, when I felt very raw, because that would have been the thing that had kind of wrapped me up, not in bubble wrap against my feelings. So like, you take that away and I'm like, oh. And I was playing like Sonic the Hedgehog for about 6 hours a day. And I just like, it was compulsive. And I remember my very good therapist sort of really challenging that. And I was like, what she's fucking on about? You know, at least I'm not on the smack anymore. But she, you know, and it felt like I didn't really understand that idea that I was just numbing out with Sonic Hedgehog. And I can still hear those kind of clang of rings.
Oh, yeah.
Like it's like ingrained in my head somewhere. But yeah, I mean, she really challenged that, and I was like, ooh, I can't do anything, can't have any fun. But she recognised that I was not dealing with actually, you know, reality. I was not able to navigate, or was not navigating reality in a way that might have been more useful. Now, I do want to steer away from that a bit. As I say today, it's like, Freud's just like, look, here are the things we do. Yeah, there's no like, and you shouldn't, and you should be doing this. It's just like, this is what we do to be in the world.
Yeah, I think that kind of, I think it's really important to sort of normalize these things a little bit. Me and Liz were sort of talking really briefly yesterday, and like there is a lot of attention on like change of behavior and like negative behaviors, and like I think it's really important just to be able to acknowledge that actually some of these behaviors are positive and useful.
They serve a purpose. I mean, I think that's the thing about, psychology and learning about yourself is just kind of recognizing that what you're doing, by and large serves a purpose. And, the important thing is to understand what it is, what the purpose is, rather than, beating yourself up about what you're doing, providing yourself another stick to just beat yourself up with.
Yeah. Well, I think that feels like a goodish place to end this podcast. And any final comments from anybody?
No.
No.
My ego is feeling strong today.
Yeah.
A big meaty burger.
Yeah, I can go off and intellectualize it all now.
Just know that you're doing it. It's fine.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I think it's also partly like when when you kind of meet somebody or talk to somebody who you feel connection with and you feel seen and whole, and this is like this sense of real kind of, being present and robust and there is where what we're trying to do here. So that's the end of podcast number 4. That's it. So we'll be having discussions with people about this in the seminar groups. But yeah, thank you for listening.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Liz.
All right.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.